So we're going to just jump right into the show today. One of the big topics out there for many, many years now is the long-going effort to achieve reparations, reparatory justice for the centuries of enslavement and segregation and other forms of oppression that the Black community has faced in this country. Certainly something that the right wing has stated is, one of the worst things happening, that they're advocates for reparations. In the state of Maryland, the governor, Wes Moore, actually vetoed a little bit earlier this year State Bill 587, which was pushing for a reparations study commission. There is now an ongoing effort to get that veto overturned inside of the state legislature. Very important issue on a number of different fronts. And we are very, very honored to be joined to discuss this by Dayvon Love, who is the Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle based in Baltimore City. Dayvon, as always, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Yep. Thanks for having me on, as always.
Well, I mean, give us a sense of what's happening, because I remember when the veto happened, Governor Wes Moore said that we don't need to study the issue anymore. We just need action, and we just need to start doing anything. Maybe I missed it. I'm living in Baltimore. I haven't seen what he's doing on this front, but give us a sense of what this bill was going to do, and if whether or not his sort of rhetoric around why he vetoed it stands up to scrutiny.
Yeah, and I'm gonna provide a little bit of additional context. You know, my organization, we do legislative advocacy, and one of our customs is that we meet with the presiding officers or their chiefs of staff, and the governor and their team. So in 2023 and 2024, in the summertime, we actually presented the administration a series of proposals, because reparations isn't going to be like one big policy that just happens kind of ubiquitously. There's going to be local, federal, state, like a variety of different policies. And what we did was we presented some revenue packages and a structure for how reparations would operate. So for instance, we discussed things like raising the capital gains tax as a revenue source for reparations, or changing the income tax so that higher earners are paying more, right? So those are the kinds of things that we offer to the administration. And what we were told was that given Maryland's budget crisis, that the governor didn't want to commit additional aspects of the state budget to something like reparations. We then worked with the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland to then put in a bill that essentially would do two really important things. The first is that it would study, the specific harms done to people of African descent in the state of Maryland as a result of Jim Crow, enslavement, and all the other forms of structural racial oppression. And then secondly, and more importantly, is that this commission would produce recommendations on how to implement a reparations policy in Maryland. And that part of it is important, going into your question about the governor's response, in that he's more interested in action. One of the things that for us is important is that it's not something that a governor simply can do on their own, right? It requires legislative action, and it shouldn't just be up to one individual person to determine what that looks like. And so so just two things. One, when he says he wants action, we presented some action, right? And it wasn't heeded. So then we, as a compromise, decided to work on a bill that would create a commission that would study what it would like to implement that policy. It is my opinion that there are folks within the Democratic Party establishment that have aspirations for the governor to run for president. And I described the veto of this bill. I'm sure some of your listeners may remember this term, the sister soldier moment, right? So the idea of distinguishing himself from the kind of political and historical roots of the reparations movement, the kind of revolutionary Pan-African nationalist, Black nationalist, socialist aspects of the movement that are the most ardent advocates for something like reparations. I think that the veto represents a rebuffing that wing, right, of our freedom struggle in order to preserve the possibility for a presidential run.
That's an interesting way to put it. And I'm curious if you could speak to the fact that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Governor Wes Moore, this is somebody who is, I believe, the first African-American governor of Maryland and the third African-American governor elected to office in any state. So I'm just curious, like the irony of having this person who has broken a ceiling be the one to veto this bill.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge is that mainstream renderings of Black political activity in the United States has framed the success of Black people based on the matriculation of individual Black people up the economic and political ladder. And so in many respects, Wes Moore represents a version, right, of that approach to Black politics. And so a part of what that does, so when you think about the theory of change that is rooted in that thinking, right, what it does is that it makes the aspirations of Black people contingent on a Black person that is agreeable politically to a white mainstream as the basis to deliver things for our community. And the reality is that that frame does not provide the kind of liberatory solutions that we need, right? And we see the Democrats, going more to the center as a response to Donald Trump's victory in the presidential election, because there's a core of the Democratic Party, corporate, white dominated, right, that covets, voters, those suburban voters, right, for many of which issues that face Black people are not their top concern. They want to maintain a kind of liberal American capitalist democracy, right, that maintains the status quo. And so I think that's the challenge that we're faced with, is that, as we say in our community, Black faces in high places, right, doesn't translate to outcomes for the masses of our people.
No, I think that's such a good point, and I think it speaks to also the earlier point you were making about sort of trying to sever sort of 21st century Black politics from the history of the Black political stream. There is a river, as Dr. Vincent Harding said, and I guess this happened in the 21st century. But I remember the Millions for Reparations rally in D.C. in 2003, and yes, Al Sharpton was there, but so was Sophia Bukhari, who played actually a big role in that event for people who remember, because it was kind of axiomatic, yes, we deserve reparations. This is not, the past is not past, and I wanted to also ask you about that too, because it also feels like it's a severing of historical memory in what they're asking people to do. I mean, I had the opportunity to go to the Lewis Museum here in Baltimore a few months ago, and just learn more about the history of enslavement and lynchings and all these things. And it's not long ago, you know what I mean? And the impact of the industries that have been built up in this state and around the country, the wealth, it's so obvious, how this has contemporary relevance, but it's almost like asking people to forget that and just act like it's not true, to go with this idea from a propagandistic attitude from the right wing that it isn't true when we know it is.
Yeah, I mean, one distinction I think is really important to make is the distinction between sovereignty and economic inclusion. One of the things that Governor Moore mentioned in his veto letter were some of the things that his administration has done that have been good for Black folks. Procurement policy, so that there's more Black businesses that are able to do business with the state, right? Talked about some of his policies in terms of helping individual Black homeowners, right? He mentioned the mass pardon that he issued for cannabis possession charges, which I would argue doesn't really get at the heart of the criminal justice system, particularly possession with intent to distribute, particularly the other ways that people are tracked into the criminal justice system. These things are good policy. Reparations is about investing in Black people's capacity to practice sovereignty. That when you think about the collective station that people of African descent occupy in this society, that the life-preserving institutions that are necessary for a people to navigate the society with a level of comfort and ease, all of those life-preserving institutions are controlled by entities outside of our community. In many respects, that is by definition colonialism. So reparations, as it emerges from the radical Pan-African nationalist and Black nationalist tradition, recognizes the importance of sovereignty, right, as the prerequisite for any kind of democracy anywhere. And reparations is about investing in our capacity to practice that kind of sovereignty and self-determination. So one of the things that I think in Governor Moore's veto letter is that he is confusing what may be good policy with what reparations is, right? He's describing things that I think facilitate more economic inclusion into the American mainstream, which for individual people may be good. But if we're talking about Black people as a collective, reparations is about investing in our collective ability to practice freedom and have liberation. And that confusion, I think, is a part of the rhetoric that the governor is using when he says, I'm going to engage in action. And as you said, the things that are necessary to repair these harms aren't things that happened that long ago, right? And so, I mean, one example, Goldsecker, major foundation in Baltimore City, responsible for a lot of the blockbusting that happened in West Baltimore, right? They have a foundation, right, that has an endowment of several millions of dollars. The basis of that wealth, right? We're talking the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, right? And so this is why you need a commission to study it, right? This is not something that one person can do. You need a commission to study, to look at all of these things and to be, and so one thing that I want to say quickly, something that we're going to introduce into this upcoming Maryland General Assembly is a policy that would tax endowments and put those resources into a reparations fund. See, if we're talking about action, right, and we're talking about reparations, then those are the kinds of policies that we need to be putting forward, which again, is something that I think we should study, right? But in the absence of the work to, have this commission, then we're putting forward policies that we think are important to discuss in terms of what it would look like to get reparations.
I was watching like a clip from the Breakfast Club that was making the rounds on Twitter, and it was like Ben Shapiro, and I'm so sorry to even give space to his name, but the host was like Ben Shapiro was talking against reparations, obviously, because he's like a virulent right winger who is like very much like, well, Black people, that happened forever ago. Black people need to get over it. Basically, he pretty openly like says it almost like that. And the host was like, what about Israel? What about like Jews in Israel? Like Israel got Jews got reparations in Israel, and he's like, that's different. And it is interesting to me, just like the level of, when it comes to this country, the idea that like this happened so long ago, just get over it, is so ingrained culturally. And I would say that goes beyond just the right. And that brings me to what I would like to ask you about here. And that is the fact that you and others are now calling for the Legislative Black Caucus to basically override the governor's veto. So I'm curious, what kind of political pressure, institutional resistance is the caucus facing, either from Democratic Party leadership, because obviously this governor's a Democrat, also lobbyists, or even the governor's office itself? Like, is that even doable?
So we're actively working to support the Black Caucus in overriding the veto. And I'll say a few things to your question. The first is that I think one of the things I'm proud of is that when I talk to like just, random Black folks on the street who've heard or pay any attention, most people that I hear when I talk to them, they think it's crazy that the governor vetoed the bill. Like, I think the rank and file of the Black community in Maryland, right, I think generally feels that way. Now, I think people simultaneously feel a sense of obligation to want to protect him politically. But even in the midst of that, there are people who I've spoken to that simultaneously understand the importance of overriding the veto while also wanting to protect and preserve Wes Moore as a person in his political career. And so it is my read that the members of the Black Caucus are working very hard on this override. And Maryland is interesting because Maryland has a 30% Black population, right? And so because of that, and so we have a large Black caucus. So it's created a dynamic where, we put a bunch, myself and the Black Caucus and other organizations have put a lot of pressure, on other elected officials to support the work of overriding the veto. And it is my understanding that the governor is working really very hard, right, to push back, to try to peel off support for this veto override. So right now, if you ask me, like, what do I think the prospects are? I would say about 65-35 override. Like that if you ask me today, that's kind of where I think things are. And one of the things I think is really important to say is that the success of the veto override, I think, is important because I think it would demonstrate an advance in Black folks' political maturity around not feeling like you have to both support a policy that is problematic to support an individual Black person who we may think is a good person. But we need to develop the capacity of challenging Black folks in those positions, right, that take conservative positions. We need to demonstrate that it is possible to both care about him as a human being, but also know that on this policy that he's wrong, and for that to be okay. And so our hope is that this veto override is more than just about like the state of Maryland, right, and us establishing this commission, but showing people that, yeah, we need to challenge our own elected officials, right, when they take positions that are not good for the masses of our community.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the beautiful political education effect of actually organizing, is the ability to try to bring these things through. And let me just ask you before we let you go, Dayvon, if anyone is watching in Maryland and is wondering how they can contribute to, the efforts you all are pushing at LBS along with others, where should they go? Where can they look?
So lbsbaltimore.com, LBS Baltimore, all your relevant social media. Sign up to be on our listserv. We're actually going to be putting out action alerts in the coming weeks for people to call their elected representatives. and to urge them to support the override. I know for some people that may seem small, but those emails add up and they're important. It makes elected officials feel the pressure, particularly if it comes from people they represent. It gives them the sense that they have to do something. And so if you go to lbsbaltimore.com, sign up to be on our mailing list. We'll give you all the information, the scripts, all the things that one needs to contact our elected officials to help us with this override.
Right on. Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Thank you so much, as always, for some of your time here in the
Thanks for having me on.